Hi guys! Today we are continuing in our series, In My Opinion. And I want to start off by asking you some questions, okay? So first question, why are your friends your friends? Like out of all the people in the world that you could have become friends with, how did you end up being friends with those particular people? Like what is it that drew you to them and that drew them to you? I want you to think about all of the groups or the cliques that you're aware of. How do people end up in those particular groups or cliques? Well, if you think about it, it probably is what you think it is, right? We tend to like sameness. We tend to be drawn to people that are like us or people that are similar to us in that they're interested in the same things or they agree with us about things that we feel like are important. And that is fine. That is totally normal, right? There's nothing wrong with that. However, sometimes we tend to form lots of strong opinions about people that are in the other friend groups or people that we think of as just being very different from ourselves. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Often, we tend to think that our opinions are so accurate that we don't even realize they're opinions. We actually tend to think sometimes that they're facts, right? Like, sure, we don't know the people that are outside of our friend group all that well, but we definitely tend to think that we do, right? And what we think to be true of other people shapes our opinion of who they are. We tend to make some judgments, sometimes pretty quick judgments, that form those opinions about who that person is. But those judgments, those impressions, don't paint a full picture of who that person is. So just to illustrate this, I want us to try something, okay? So think for a minute about the friend groups or the cliques that you're aware of, right? And you probably have some assumptions or some opinions about each and every one of those. And so just to kind of bring to mind what your assumptions might be, I want you to pay attention to what pops into your mind when I ask you about each one of these scenarios, okay? What comes to mind when I say, the rich kids are, or all the cheerleaders, or smart kids think, or VSCO girls are always, or people that game all day are. I bet right now you're filling in each one of those blanks with what you think you know about each of those groups of people. And we all do that, right? Like this even happens at church, right? Like you might be reluctant to come to church, or there might be people at church that you kind of like steer clear of because you have opinions about them. Sometimes people you've never talked to. But you might find yourself forming opinions about people that go to a particular school or sit in a particular part of the den or are in a particular grade, right? You find yourself writing a story about them in your head, but sometimes that story is based on like never having interacted with them. And again, we're forming these opinions based on assumptions. And so those assumptions translate into an opinion, and we feel like those opinions are pretty much facts. So that can be really tricky because assumptions and opinions come from all sorts of places. One of the places where we form some of our strongest opinions is when we've had a negative experience with someone or with a group of people in the past. Like, let's say you've had a person or a group of people and they bullied you or they hurt you or they embarrassed you. They just weren't that kind to you. That can really shape your opinion of them. And you can find yourself saying, this person is always like this, or that group of people, they just always do this, right? So a past experience, particularly if it's negative, can really shape the way that you form an opinion of a group of people. Or sometimes we actually don't have those bad experiences. We just kind of have an assumption. You know, those assumptions are kind of just stereotypes, things that we tend to think are true. Even if we don't really know if they are, we tend to assume that they are. And so we make assumptions about groups of people. Now, sometimes we have opinions that are really based on jealousy or insecurity, particularly if someone's life just seems to be easier or happier than yours, or if they have things you wish you had. You might find yourself being kind of judgmental of them because you're jealous or you're insecure. Whatever the reason, when it comes to people that are different from us, people that we really don't understand, we tend to let our judgments and opinions affect how we view them overall. Often, we form a negative opinion or a judgment of someone and we lock into that way of thinking. Like we've already made up our minds about them. Like we don't need to get to know them. We don't need to learn anything else about them. In our minds, we already know who they are. But that is really problematic. An unwillingness to alter our perceptions of who someone is allows us to write a story about them in our minds, decide who they are, and then decide that they're not worth getting to know. And often when we do that, we're tending to think of them as being less than us. We tend to think that we are superior to them. And when we do this, sometimes we think that if they're inferior to us, less than us, that we then have license to name call or to treat them poorly. And you find this happening when you hear people talk about a group of people at being like, oh my gosh, they're just a bunch of idiots, or she's a crackhead, or oh, they're a bunch of nerds, or what a loser, right? What we're doing in those moments is we're shaping our whole view of a complex person on a label like idiot or crackhead. We've decided that that word describes everything about that person. And that's a real problem because we're defining that person by one experience, one interaction, one assumption. We are operating on very little information about that person. We're not seeing their whole story. We're not seeing the whole person. And seeing the whole person matters, right? And so to help us understand that it matters, I want us to look at a story in the Bible that I think will change the way that we see other people. Now, this story is found in the book of John, and it's written by one of Jesus's closest friends and followers who's named John. Now, when we pick up our story, Jesus is teaching a group of people, and when he's teaching, several religious leaders interrupt him with a question that they feel is really important. They come up to him and they say, "Teacher," they said to Jesus, "this woman was caught in an act of adultery. The law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say?" Now, basically what these religious leaders came to Jesus with is a question about a woman that has been caught in adultery. That means that she's been caught sleeping with someone that is not her husband, okay? So you think of the judgment that we would all tend to have with that information. We would probably be like, ooh, you should not be doing that. Like, you are a bad person. You should not be doing that, right? And these religious leaders, they're forming those same opinions, and they also are well aware of the laws of the time. And so back then, when somebody committed adultery, which is what she's done, the consequence was that you would be stoned. Stoning basically means that people would literally pick up stones and throw them at you until you died. So these religious leaders are approaching Jesus, and I think they're pretty confident that they know what Jesus is going to say about this woman, right? Because they're thinking like, Jesus, you for sure care that people should not do what she's been doing, right? And so they're basically kind of saying like, Jesus, she's really bad, right? Like, we need to kill her because we're good people. Like, we're not doing that, but she's trashy. Like, she sleeps around. She's one of like those people. Now, I think if we're honest, we can all admit that sometimes we're like these religious leaders. Sometimes we have a tendency to think of ourselves as being better or more holy than other people. And when we do that, we tend to judge those people and then let our opinions and our judgments define who they are. And even more, once we've decided that they're beneath us, that we're good and that they're bad, we tend to distance ourselves from them. Right? We tend to not want to have anything to do with them, right? We start to even say things like, "Oh, I don't hang out with those people." Or, "Yeah, I'm not one of them," right? Or that creates a real us versus them dynamic where we tell ourselves that we are the good guys and that those people are the bad guys. And so that's kind of what these religious leaders are doing here with this woman. And I think they probably expect that, Jesus, he cares that we live in a good way. So they're probably expecting that Jesus is going to be like, yeah, she's bad. Go ahead, stone her. But look at how Jesus responds. This is in John chapter 8. It says, all the religious leaders kept demanding an answer. So he stood up. This is Jesus. He stood up again and he said, all right. But let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone. Then Jesus stoops down again and he starts writing in the dust. Jesus challenges these religious leaders to look inward at themselves and at their own sin instead of judging her. Jesus tells them, go ahead, you can stone her as long as you have never done anything wrong in your life, as long as you have never sinned. As long as you've never messed up or made a mistake or done something wrong. So, yeah, I mean, if that's you, as you think you're better than her. So if in fact you are better than her because you've never done anything wrong in your life, then go ahead, pick up a stone and throw it at her. If you can prove you haven't sinned, go ahead. Well, interestingly enough, the only person ever that could say that is Jesus, right? Jesus is the only person who's never sinned. But notice that instead of throwing stones, what happens next is that John writes that after they hear Jesus say this, that one by one they start to just leave, right? Like no longer are they so focused on stoning her. They're like, yeah, I have sinned, so I'm just gonna go back to my business, right? And look at what happens next. Jesus stands up again and he says to the woman, where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you? No, Lord, she said. And Jesus said, neither do I. Go and sin no more. While these religious leaders had judged this woman on only one thing that they knew about her, Jesus could see that yes, what she was doing was wrong. But that's not the total picture of who she is, that there is more to this woman. Jesus sees this woman as way more than one bad decision. She is much more than just one opinion, one judgment, one experience. Jesus sees her for the full story of who she is. And so he's able to love her as a whole person, regardless of the fact that in the moment she's doing something she shouldn't be doing. What's interesting is that nobody in this story is as simple and one-dimensional as they tend to think or as we tend to represent them, right? Like everyone judged this woman as bad. Looking at her, feeling like you know what she's about, she's bad. But Jesus shows us, no, that's not true. There's more to her than that. This is a woman who is worthy of forgiveness and she has a future. And everyone tends to judge the religious leaders in this story as good, right? Like they're the religious leaders. But Jesus shows you're no better than her, right? Like even though you're a religious leader, you've sinned too. Here's the truth. We are all made in the image of God. You are, and so is every single person that you have passed judgment on. God loves all of us, and that makes every person worthy of his love and his forgiveness. That is the way that Jesus saw other people, and he calls us to see them the same way. Jesus wants us to remember that there is more to other people than just the opinions that we quickly form of them. And that when we reduce someone to just one judgment or one opinion, that causes us to miss out on the full picture of who they are. So I want you to go back to those opinions that came to your mind about groups of people that we talked about in the beginning, right? Those things where I said, so the rich kids are, or Visco girls always, or people that game all day are. And to be aware of what comes to mind. It is important for you to realize that if you're judging somebody and you're putting a label on them, that you are missing out on all the complexity of who they really are as a person. You're only taking one piece of information and you're deciding all sorts of other things about them based on very little information. And so, in order to change the way we think about others, I want you to try to remember a couple of things this week. The first one is notice that Jesus, with the religious leaders, as with us, he says, focus on you. Jesus reminds those religious leaders, like, hey, we've all got our own mistakes and weaknesses that we need to work on. So instead of going around and pointing out other people's flaws, other people's bad behaviors, the choices they're making that you don't agree with or you don't understand, stop doing that. You worry about you. Right? Stop worrying about other people's business. You focus on, how does God want me to live? What is God asking of me? How do I need to grow? And then work on that. The other thing I would encourage you to do is to just pay attention to who you've judged, to who you have already formed an opinion about without getting to know them. And what if without judging them, you just become aware that there's more to that person? That they are a complete whole person, and that rather than judge, it's worth getting to know the complete whole person and withholding judgment. It is a good reminder for us that when we don't know much about someone else or we don't know much about a group of people, when there's a gap in the information, when we don't really know somebody, what we need to put in that gap is grace. Because here's what we do know, even if we don't know a lot about them. What we do know is that they are a child of God, that they are made in his image and that they deserve his love. And we want to start there. And what we also know is that we want to have a heart that looks like Jesus's heart. And so instead of making assumptions of others and deciding that we're superior and they're beneath us, and then we can name call them and treat them badly and assume all sorts of things without having that information, that we want to be people that look at others with compassion, that assume the best, that look at them with love and with kindness and with grace and a willingness to see the fullness of who they are as a person rather than reducing them to just some simple label. And we're going to do that because that's the way Jesus looks at us, and so we're going to look at others that way as well. I love you guys. Have a great week.